This is History on Drugs, and today we're going to talk about the history of cocaine. Now, I don't particularly like cocaine. I'm not a big fan. I just love the way it smells. Favorite cocaine joke. If you know, you know. Um, so cocaine doesn't have like this in-depth, rich, exciting history like some of the other substances we talk about, alcohol or opium, right? Where it was grown in many different regions and it was early trade in ancient civilizations. It was essentially isolated and localized to South America. So cocaine comes from the cocaine plant. It's like little gumballs. You take them now. Cocaine comes from the coca plant, and the coca plant is nothing sexy. It's just a little bush, like 3, 4 feet high. The plants don't look exciting, or the leaves don't look that exciting. There's no flowers on them or anything like that. Archaeologists first discovered ancient man using the coca plant for its stimulating properties about 5,000 years ago. The leaves, remnants of the leaves, were discovered in burials and also in the cheeks of skeletons. The leftover leaf, is it leaf or leaves? Leaf. The leftover remnants of the leaves were discovered in the cheeks. And from that period in the ancient Andean peoples in like Peru, and then, like I said, also grew in like Colombia and Bolivia naturally. So, but there wasn't like trade or anything that at least we have discovered at this point going on. But they were using it for its stimulating properties. What it would do was it would suppress their appetite, and it's a stimulant. Like, it wouldn't get them high like we think modern day cocaine, but it definitely got a little pep in their step, right? So it wasn't until the Moche people or the early Inca Empire in like the 13, 1400s in Peru specifically, where more widespread use was discovered. In fact, researchers have found pottery depicting the use of, or depicting the coca plant, and then drawings depicting the use of the coca plant, and archaeological finds suggesting that it was used in, like, medicinal purposes, ceremonial purposes, but most importantly, to help promote and motivate labor. So this is a very mountainous region in Peru. So if you think about Machu Picchu, right, it's this magnificent. Should we just start over? Magnificent city that's like built on top of these like 12, 13,000 foot mountains. And you're like, how the hell did they build this? But well, they're high on coca, right? So they could go up in the mountains, and the coca also helped with altitude sickness. Now that would be more for people coming into the region, because just through basic evolution, the Peruvian peoples and the Incas, they weren't getting, most of them, the altitude sickness like we would get if we like flew in there. But the coca leaf would help reduce any symptoms of altitude sickness. Also, like we said, suppress the appetite so they didn't have to carry food into the mountains to work. And more importantly, it gave them a little pep in their step, right? So they could just move and work long days and just keep those leaves in their mouth and chew them all day. Also, what they started to figure out was, hey, if these leaves are doing something to us, there must be something in those leaves that's doing it. So they started to mess around with it, and then they made a concoction, like an extract that was lime based. And what they discovered was that if you mixed lime with the coca leaf, it would extract some of the cocaine alkaloids so that it was more powerful, right? And now it started seeing more significance in religious and spiritual situations. And like, honestly, some of their situations were pretty like sketchy. Like, they would sacrifice people, they would sacrifice children, and the coca was present in this, and the sacrifice, right? And everybody would take it, and it'd be kind of like creepy and scary, and nobody wants to sacrifice a kid. They love the kids, I'm sure, but this was their belief that if they sacrificed something to their gods, that their crops would be better, their health would be better, society would be better. And that was what a lot of ancient societies, not just children, just general sacrificing of people, would help them, the community, have better success overall. So to look back on today, it's like, oh, how could you do that? But that's kind of like what they believed. So these people are living, they got their coca, they're building great things on the mountains like Machu Picchu and other structures. And then in the 1500s, along comes the white people, right? Along comes the conquistadors, and they come in, Spanish conquistadors, and they kind of just roll through like Mexico, Central America, South America, and they bring with them like sickness, like just the common cold of a conquistador. If they interact with the local peoples, the tribal people, they would get sick and die. So it was found that just getting them sick was easier to kill them than actually having battles with them, even though they didn't have the types of weaponry as the conquistadors did. And they would bring their horses over on boats, and they would just roll through and kill all these people and then ultimately enslave them. And so what happened with the coca is the Spanish conquistadors enslaved the people, made them go work, and what they made them do is go mine for silver in Peru because it was so prominent there, and that was like the biggest currency at the time around the globe, right? And they would just keep digging in those mountains, get us that silver. We're going to bring it back to Europe and to China and to the rest of the world. And then the Spanish Empire became hugely successful and prominent in the 1500s. But the Spanish, when they discovered the coca, they're like, look at these weirdos chewing these leaves and spiritual and ceremonies. So the conquistadors were like, you know what? Nah, you ain't doing this on our watch. That's pagan shit. And they outlawed it. And so the use of coca was outlawed just because the Spanish said so, because they didn't understand it, because it was from a different culture. But over time, even though it's outlawed, it grows naturally there. People were using it. The conquistadors were discovering, like, wait a second, this stuff's got some real power to it. This might be another commodity we could extract from their land and just rape all their land and their commodities and bring them to the rest of the world to sell to grow our empire. So they eventually ixnayed the outlaw, made it legal again, and then they started feeding it to the slaves so that they could work faster and harder and stronger. And then, of course, they didn't have to feed them, and they could go for long days and multiple days into the mountains and just scrub the land of the resources for the rest of the world, unfortunately. Um, so the Spanish were like, hey, let's bring this to Europe and see if it catches on. Maybe we can sell this. Let's go show the queen. Let's get this thing going. So as they tried in the late 1500s, early 1600s to bring it to Europe or up into North America, into America, the trips took so long that they just threw the leaves in like a bag or a box, whatever they did. The cocaine would just kind of die out, I guess, like the alkaloid in the leaf. So the leaves would be bad. So by the time they got to Europe, they didn't have the same properties. So when they figured out, hey, mix it with the lime, let's store it better, finally, like 100 years later, they were able to get it there, sell it, tax it, but it still wasn't a huge commodity. This was no opium at the time because there just wasn't enough uses for it except for working in the fields. And it wouldn't be until the 1800s, much like other substances we talk about, where everything changes for the cocaine. And Eric Clapton, he was right? Down there, she don't lie, cocaine. I wonder if I gotta pay something for saying that on here. And I am sorry that I did. So what's been happening in the late 1700s, early 1800s, chemists and druggists and scientists, they're trying so hard, so many different ways. How do we get this, whatever's in here, we want to isolate it? Because if you think about in 1803, these same people figured out how to isolate the morphine out of the opium poppy, which we discussed in another episode, and it changed the way people used it, right? And it was much more powerful. So after decades and decades, almost 100 years of experiments and doing things like lime and other chemistry stuff in the lab, finally, a German scientist in 1855 was able to extract the coca alkaloid, right? And that's where the name cocaine came from. Because when you got an alkaloid, a lot of times they would name it like an ene or an ane, like lidocaine, right? Things like that. So it was a coca plant, and the ane for an alkaloid, they put it together, cocaine. So it's nothing sexy or magical, but they figured it out. Now, going on at the same time in South America, those people were figuring out their own ways to extract it, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So they figured out their own way to extract it. It took a little bit longer. But now in like the 1800s, now you've got the cocaine product and it starts becoming a commodity around the world for its stimulating properties, right? So now that you have a more pure cocaine, the effects are a lot stronger. So what was happening from just being a stimulating leaf you would chew with a little lime, now they were able to put it in the powder form or liquid form. So you would get euphoria, you would get stimulation, because just the dopamine, it was just like an excessive release of dopamine. So you're like, you're like, oh, speedy, do. So you have to kind of, everybody's got to figure out their own dosing of cocaine, you know? But it wasn't yet discovered that actual long-term use of it and repetitive use is quite dangerous. So what they started to do, just ahead of the Civil War in America, is put it in all kinds of other products, right? And it was going in drinks, it was going in cigarettes and gum and lozenges, and those were being marketed. So people were capitalizing on the opportunity, and the same thing was happening in Europe, in the Near East, and in China. So the product was moving. They were looking for medicinal purposes for it. So at the time, they were able to use it as like a localized anesthesia for surgeries in the eyes and the mouth because they had numbing properties. But that really wouldn't catch on long term because I mentioned before, like lidocaine, other safer numbing products came out that didn't have the dangerous high or side effects as cocaine. So as we get into the Civil War, cocaine is used in all these medical tents we talk about. Didn't create the problems or wasn't as prevalent as like opium and morphine, but it was certainly used as a stimulant during that war when available and accessible. But it wouldn't be till like the 1870s where these products that we mentioned really just started to flood the market. And then people started also creating drinks, right? So later on in this century, we get Coca-Cola, which was cocaine-based for so long, right? Because it used cola nuts and cocaine and then other stuff in there. There's another thing called Marini wine, and it was wine and cocaine. And so as America, after the Civil War, into the Gilded Age, started settling out west, cocaine was a huge product for like the expansion and working on the railroads and these little towns with saloons and brothels. And the cowboys would smoke the cigarettes and chew the gum or snort the powder. You would get these dudes driving around in wagons and they'd be like snake oil salesmen, right? Like Sloppy Joe's soothing syrup. Step right up, get some cocaine gum. It will change your sex life. It'll help your baby feel better. You know, they had all these uses for it and it was advertised in magazines and it was just part of society. So at the time, in the Gilded Age, no one was really looking at it like in a negative way. Like we would look at it like, oh no, they're using cocaine. Oh my. No, it was just part of everything like opium was earlier until they saw the problems with it. But then the temperance movement, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union was traveling around the country talking about the moral failings of America. The same thing was happening in Europe, like society's falling apart because of alcohol and there's drugs and opium abusers. And we're talking like not just a small percentage of the culture. In America, we're talking like 1 million or 2 people between all these drugs, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and women drinking laudanum. And just regular consumers buying the products and the railroad workers and the Western expansion. There's millions of people using this stuff. So this women's temperance movement, even though it was driven to outlaw alcohol, it would still encapsulate these other substances as part of the moral failing of society. So now people started catching on. And when they saw what long-term use of the cocaine started doing and the side effects, which like would include psychosis and paranoia, and like doing stuff with like your heart rhythm, you know, and it wasn't like you'd have like heroin, you'd have an overdose, but you could have a heart attack or you could stretch yourself out or you could just go nuts or delusional for a long time. And then it would deteriorate your heart. and your mind. So long term, it just wasn't sustainable to stay on that drug, which is one of the reasons it never really caught on for like medical purposes. And even today in the world, like it's got very little uses anywhere around the globe for medicinal purposes. As we get into the 1900s and Europe and America, well, not all of Europe, because Germany was, they were still rocking their thing, but like England and the United States, they're like, okay, man, too much alcohol, too many drugs. They started creating regulations for the first time about drugs. And the Harrison Act in 1914 said, hey, no longer can we just sell this shit at the store or in a magazine. It's got to be regulated, right? The amount that's imported, the amount that can be distributed to medical professionals. And the Harrison Act of 1914 put ixnay on just the freewheeling cowboy universe of heroin, morphine, opium, and cocaine. However, just a couple years later, the Great War, World War I, which would be fought all over the world by millions and millions of soldiers in like hundreds of places. It wasn't just in Europe, right? It was like in the continent of Africa and in Asia and in the seas of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a deadly war, and it was a war of attrition where it's like just awful. Like millions died, and the British government actually gave a product called Forced March to their soldiers in World War One, which was like a lozenger, and this would do the same things that we talk about in World War II and in the Civil War as a stimulant. Now they didn't have to eat as much. Now they can march longer, but more importantly, with the euphoria of it, now they can sit in those trenches and not be so depressed and down on themselves. So it was looked upon in war as a positive thing. So a lot of these soldiers had rations of forced march. And even all the countries, they had rations of alcohol and tobacco, right? So they're like, here, just take this stuff. We know you're fighting, it'll soothe it. But going on in the rest of the world is like, this stuff's all bad. We need to change society. And then finally, in the 1920s, in Europe and America, regulation got even tougher and laws got even stronger, and drugs from a global perspective, instead of just localized to like America or just to England, became highly illegal and managed. And then prohibition kicked in the United States, where that 13-year period we outlawed alcohol. And in that time, organized crime syndicates popped up and gangs and black markets. So they would flourish in the future because of their ability to create these markets and distribute alcohol legally and pay off cops and government officials. Eventually, they would just fill that alcohol gap with drugs. So heroin and cocaine became something that these organized crime syndicates, and eventually just people in the inner cities and out in the country too, they were just selling drugs illegally. So it never got erased from the earth, obviously, because we still have problems with drugs today. But cocaine was no longer just a freewheeling cowboy drug that everybody could use. So it was used by Americans illegally in the 1920s during Prohibition. That was our great generation of experimenting with like partying and music and smoking and drinking illegally and doing heroin and doing cocaine. But then we go into like the World War II generation. Society was a lot different. There was like so much nationalism in countries around the world, and so much more of, just being a good human, a faithful human, a citizen that was positive. And drug use was, even though it was existing, it became less prevalent for a small time. And then it wouldn't be until like the counterculture movement in the 1960s, right? If you think about the hippies and Woodstock and the Grateful Dead, right? There a lot of marijuana and LSD became part of pop culture. So more kids and even adults just started experimenting with drugs because they would see it on the news or in a TV show or featured in a movie, or music started to emerge that was different, right? With like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And because of these things, society changed a lot, and what people would do for fun changed significantly. So by the time we get to the 1970s, specifically in America, that generation of younger people was all about letting loose, influenced by the counterculture of the 60s. And they were experimenting with drugs, but their number one drug would become cocaine. So America's thirst for cocaine and going to nightclubs and dancing, or just be having freer sex lives and experimenting with different things, cocaine became a real problem. And then by the time we get to the early 1980s, the markets are flooded. And a guy named Pablo Escobar, which everybody knows, like one of the biggest drug dealers of all time, billions and billions of dollars of drugs moved all over the world. But most of all the cocaine was going to the United States. It was going other places, but I think Americans consumed like almost like 85% of the world's cocaine, which is just nuts. That sounds like a societal problem to me. I mean, there could be a proximity as well too, because a lot of the coca is in South America, obviously, and it's funneling. And then we had a not a wealthy society, but compared to the rest of the world, we had money and people could buy a gram for $100, which you couldn't do in Malawi, or in remote parts of Asia, or in Moscow, right? So here we had excess capital for people, and they were experimenting. And so Pablo Escobar flooded LA and Miami, and they would just get so creative by the way they were bringing in coke. And I'm sure everybody's seen Narcos on Netflix or watched something with Pablo. They just got so creative. They would melt down the cocaine, build a vase out of cocaine, and then melt it back down and sell it or trunks. My favorite shows is To Catch a Smuggler or Border Patrol, and those are modern. Like now here in 2025, they're still trying to smuggle drugs in. They're swallowing it, getting it on an airplane, because there's so much money in it. But now let's think about it. So we talk about drugs on this show all the time from a history perspective because it's very fascinating. I think no one ever taught me, at least, or anybody, this stuff in like history class, and we didn't have a lot of the knowledge because the way researchers and archaeologists can test ancient pottery is different than when I was a kid years and years ago. So there's a lot more discoveries and research and technology to say, hey, there's a different story. Like we didn't know the Germans were on freaking methamphetamine. That wasn't a thing until like 10 years ago. And now people are going back in the archives and be like, oh yeah, it does say it right here. And this evidence was found. So that's why we talk about these drugs here, but I definitely don't condone it or promote it. In fact, I spent 7 years working for a nonprofit, working directly with people who had substance use addictions, and the things I dealt with and saw firsthand from on many levels would blow your mind. So if I'm not here like, hey, just say no to drugs, kids. Everybody can make their own choices, but here's something you should think about if you want to snort cocaine. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of us have, right? It's just maybe part of growing up in suburban the United States, maybe not. It doesn't make you cool or not cool. But the way these labs in South America are just out of this world, right? They are just absolutely out of this world. I just want to make sure I get this right. So I'm going to read it off this list here. So they on the side of mountains from Colombia down to Peru, there are really poor people in poor villages that are working in these conditions that are horrendous, right? They'll just set up a tarp because now there's so many helicopters and satellites and militaries looking for drug producing facilities. But if you're ever going to use cocaine, I want you to listen to me clearly now to see how it's being made, okay? So they would hide out in the mountains. They would just go take the coca, they dry out the leaves, and then when they dried out the leaves, they got to crush them down. And when they crush them down, they get their like fungusy toes of a poor guy that hasn't showered, and he's like, you think about fancy in Italy, hey, we're crushing wine grapes. Well, that's what was happening with these coca leaves. What is happening? And then they would have to soak them in gasoline, either kerosene or diesel gas, because it dissolves the alkaloids, right? And then once they do that, they have to drain it, that liquid, and it leaves behind a cocaine paste. So far in the past, you got gas, you got foot fungus, you got horrible conditions. Who knows what those guys are eating and talking over the stuff is eventually going to snort into your bloodstream. And then when they get this paste, they mix it with sulfuric acid, and that removes any impurities. Okay, well, that makes me feel better. Get rid of all the toe fungus and stuff. I don't know why I'm stuck on that. I'm just picturing these little Peruvian guys smashing up the leaves. And then they add ammonia to it, right? So it's like all this stuff you're going to be snorting, man. And they do that to separate the cocaine base from the liquid. And then that base is dried out and they add hydrochloric acid into it. And then over time that turns into chunks in the powder that we see it. So when it leaves South America after this process, it's only worth, like a kilo, it's a couple $1,000s. And as it trucks or however it's moved north, as it keeps moving north and getting passed on to the next thing, that price keeps going up. By the time it gets to America, that thing is worth like $100,000. So these guys are working for nothing. The profit margins in cocaine are so tremendous. And that's why they'll go to any lengths and murders and cartels and battling. And because there's always a demand for it. So the process in which it's made is absolutely nuts, right? And then, listen, it's 2025. People are still using cocaine. I think now the bad drug in society is fentanyl, but there's ecstasy and there's drugs that I can't even pronounce. I didn't even know were drugs. So we'll be talking about some of these things soon too, which don't have a long history, but cocaine's still here. And it started as a ritualistic and a tool to help people farm in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia and Colombia. And then it turned into a commodity that got associated with partying and has been responsible for the deaths of probably millions of people when you think of cartels and overdoses and killing themselves. And people don't overdose as much like you do on heroin, right? It's just not what happens with cocaine. You could stop your heart, obviously, but it's not as prevalent as a heroin overdose, or just a little bit of fentanyl can kill you. But cocaine exists. The history is not quite as exciting as alcohol or opium, but I think it's important to know. And if you have any questions, email me, historyondrugspodcast@gmail.com. I hope you learned something about the history of cocaine.